Hi, I'd like to look at chapter 13 of 2nd Nephi. I mentioned I would go back and finish the Isaiah chapters before taking a break and trying to learn a little bit more about technology, posting these. Now, in chapter 13 of 2nd Nephi, this is another Isaiah chapter. Nephi does collect about 13 chapters together at this point in 2nd Nephi, and this is the wall that many readers hit. And they struggle with, finish understanding Isaiah, which is understandable, and they labor through this and trudge through this, and it's rather difficult material. But I'm fascinated with the question of why Nephi inserts it in the first place. I know that Isaiah was a very important prophet to him. Isaiah lived, in the 8th century, and Nephi is, of course, in the 6th century. So he must have considered Isaiah, just a really important prophet from his dispensation, someone that one of the great prophets in Israel, if not the greatest. Now, I have said in previous videos that Nephi has been already, he has inserted chapters from the second half of the book of Isaiah, and now in this particular block of chapters, he inserts the several chapters from the first half of the book of Isaiah, chapter 2 to 14, so about 13 chapters included. And I've already, in a previous video, looked at chapter 12, where we looked at the mountain of the Lord in terms of the mountain of wickedness and those that would flee to the mountains and hide their things in the mountaintops at the second coming. So I think Isaiah designed that chapter in part with directional language, the idea of abasing the wicked and exalting the Lord, as well as these two or three mountaintops that are indicated in the chapter. Now in chapter 13, and I want to say one more thing about previous videos. I have taken the time to look at the first 8 verses of chapter 25, which are principles, reading strategies for reading Isaiah that Nephi shares with us in the first 8 verses of chapter 25. And also, he has told us a few times to liken these things unto the house of Israel and any of the remnants of the house of Israel. Liken these things unto yourselves. And we talked about what that may mean. It's not just a personal likening, but it's also a corporate likening. And it may have to do with typology as well. The word liken is a word that has to do with typologies. And image to object kinds of comparisons and image to event kinds of comparisons. We have also found that Nephi has stressed and indicated that he inserts the Isaiah chapters to build our hope and to help us rejoice. And yet, ironically, he's also inserted them that he might discuss the judgments of God upon the house of Israel. And so it's kind of paradoxical because, again, what has he inserted to cause us to rejoice and to have hope and to rejoice for all of mankind? And what has he inserted that relates to the judgments of God upon the people? And again, these chapters have been seen variously. A couple approaches to these chapters is, one scholar argues that these chapters are about pride, the pride of men, humanism, the pride of exaggerating the power of men, and disregarding the work of the Lord. So pride is a major theme in the Book of Mormon, and these chapters seem to fit nicely into what Nephi says later about the Gentiles and earlier about the Gentiles, how they're high and lifted up, they're high-minded, they're caught up in their learning and in their riches and so forth. So these chapters tie into that material fairly naturally. But also another scholar has looked at these chapters to suggest that we're to understand that Jerusalem, some of these oracles are about Jerusalem, which is called Zion anciently. And some of these are having to do with what we would call Babylon or Assyria or the world, Egypt and those types of things. So it's kind of a contrast between Zion and Babylon. The same contrast was drawn as early as Lehi's dream in 1st Nephi. And that may control the material. In any case, much of this material that we're getting into in chapter 12 through 24 has to do with the judgments that come upon the house of Israel. This is the theme that I think is most dominant. Judgments that come upon the house of Israel, especially those that come upon Jerusalem and the land of Judea. But there is some here about the Assyrians. The Assyrians, of course, invaded northern Israel about a century or so before Babylon destroys and takes captive the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So largely, these chapters seem to be about judgment, the judgment of the high-minded Judites, the high-minded those inhabitants of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas that were overcome by Babylon. And also, there's a bit here about the Assyrians and their invasions of the northern kingdom down into and up to the gills of the walls of Jerusalem in about 701 BC. Okay, chapter 13, I think it's structured, I've actually made, I'm drawing help from Dana Pike here a little bit on this particular conclusion, but I like it a lot. And all the way, so if you take verses 1 through 15, this seems to be about the corrupt men of Israel, okay, or the corrupt men of Jerusalem and Judea, the surrounding region. And then verses 16 to about verse 1 of chapter 14 seems to be about the women of Israel, the women of Jerusalem, I should say, the women of Judea. Okay, so let's start it from verse 1. It says, "For behold," this is Isaiah, again, Nephi, he's apparently reading or writing these things down for his brethren. He's teaching, these are things taught among them, but he's reading from the brass plates, either to a contemporary audience or recording them simply for us on the small plates. But he says, "For behold, the Lord of hosts," that's the divine warrior language, the Lord of hosts is his name, "doth take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff." And then we get a definition for what the stay and the staff are. He says further, "the whole staff of bread and the whole stay of water." So there's scarcity. We're talking about Jerusalem and Judah. Jerusalem is Zion, okay, anciently, and it's set on some hills. Judah is the region around the villages and in the cities around Jerusalem. Jerusalem's the great city, the centerpiece, and Judah is the region around. Now, the Lord says, "I will take away from Jerusalem and Judah the staff and the stay and the staff," okay, the bread and water. So scarcity will be, bread and water will be scarce. I will take these things away. And this particular chapter is about Babylon and the Babylonian judgments that come upon, again, Jerusalem and Judah. Now, in verses 2 and 3, we get there was associated with this destruction of Jerusalem, and by the way, the temple here is destroyed. The temple's destroyed. Many are carried captive into Babylon. Verses 2 and 3 suggest that some of the elite of Jerusalem among the men are carried captive into Babylon. So the mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, the ancient, the captain of 50. Remember, Laban was a captain of 50 back in 1 Nephi. Laban, who had the brass plates record that Nephi obtained, he was a captain of 50, or at least it appears that way. "And the honorable man, and the counselor, and the cunning artificer, and the eloquent orator." Remember, Isaiah had said, "I live among a people of unclean lips." Now, Isaiah is speaking here of the destruction of Jerusalem, and of course this happens many decades, many years, a full century and more after Isaiah's day. So Isaiah is prophesying of what has not yet come to pass. But we know historically it did come to pass that Babylon did invade and destroy and carry captive many from the region of Jerusalem and Judah. Okay, so some of these types of individuals are carried captive. Remember, they were high-minded, learned. The Jews were caught up in many things. I'm going to trace some of the the iniquities of the Jews that they were engaged in. This is about the same time that Lehi is leaving Jerusalem. So it's fascinating to see just what the Jews were caught up in, just what this remnant of the house of Israel, or these inhabitants of Jerusalem, what they were caught up in. And so these are carried, some of these are carried captive. Verse 4, and I will give children unto them to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. It's not entirely clear what verse 4 means, but I think it means that those that are left are inexperienced, and those that are left have to basically learn to govern themselves without the leadership, without the mighty men and the men of war and the judges and the prophets and the prudent and so forth. So verse 4, Jerusalem's left in the hands of the inexperienced, and effectively, Jerusalem is to be left to just those that have no experience with government or with leadership or with, and so they're compared to princes and babes. And that's one way to read verse 4, I understand. Now, verse 5, it says, and the people shall be oppressed. So the people left in Jerusalem and in this region will be oppressed, everyone by another, everyone by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself badly against the proud. Sorry, it says here, the child shall behave himself proudly, rather, against the ancient or the elderly, and the base against the honorable. So social order breaks down when this deportation occurs and the destruction comes. There's great division and contention and social disarray in terms of Jerusalem and the area. Verse 6, when a man shall take hold of his brother, and there's scarcity, economic scarcity, that we further learn of in verse 6 and verse 7, because a man, Isaiah says, when this happens, a man shall take hold of his brother of the house of his father, saying, be thou our ruler. We don't have leadership. We don't have, the economy we lack bread and water, and we're struggling, and there's scarcity. And he says, basically, don't let this ruin come under thy hand. And this is, again, they're trying to find leadership and someone who can help them. And verse 7 says, in that day shall he swear, the brother who was asked to lead, saying, I will not be a healer to this city and region, for in my house I don't have clothing either. Okay? There is neither bread nor clothing in my house either. Make me not, therefore, a ruler of this people, because I have no solutions to these problems. Scarcity, the want of bread and water and clothing is, it's in my own house. How can I possibly heal this people? So the people are looking to other people. They're looking horizontally towards other people to help them with their difficulties, and they're not looking toward God for their hope and for their deliverance from the situation. And this is why they were invaded and destroyed and many carried captive, because they were not worshiping or not keeping the commandments and looking to God. So verse 8 says, for Jerusalem, this is Isaiah speaking prophetically about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah, the region, is fallen, because their tongues and their doings have been against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his judgments, or the eyes of his glory, meaning have brought these judgments upon Jerusalem and the inhabitants of the region. Verse 9, the show of their countenances, those who are in Jerusalem or who were in Jerusalem, the men, we're speaking of the men. This whole first half is about the men of of Jerusalem and the men of Judah. Okay, and it says their countenances doth witness against them, and betray them to be, and their sin is like unto those of Sodom, and they cannot hide it. Woe unto their souls, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. This is the law of the harvest. So the men in Israel apparently are struggling with sexual immoralities. That's no surprise. That seems to be the theme, throughout the history of the earth, that men have always struggled with that. So the men of Judah are apparently engaged in sins which are much like those of Sodom and so forth. Now, Sodom was struggling with not only violence and materialism, but also, sexual sins, homosexuality and other things. And so I think that's suggested here. And their countenance, it says, doth witness against them. So this is manifest in the body. When we break or transgress law, the body itself is darkened, okay? And so this is emitted, this is somehow suggested by their countenances. Now, this is the first woe we have in the chapter, and again, woe is evidence of the judgments of God. It's a word that suggests lamentation. So verse 9 ends with, woe unto their souls, the wicked of Jerusalem, the men, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. In other words, they chose it themselves. They're agents unto themselves. They brought these things upon themselves. Verse 10, say unto the righteous, this is the one glimmer of hope that Isaiah gives the righteous in this chapter. He says, say unto the righteous, because again, there were some, like Lehi and his family, and Ishmael and apparently some of his family. Say unto the righteous, it is well with them, for they will receive according to their own works. They will have the fruit of their own doings. Okay, so just like the wicked receive consequences for their choices, and they are undergoing judgments, the righteous will be rewarded for the fruits of their doings they will have as a natural consequence and restoration of their own obedience and efforts to be in covenant relationship with God. And Lehi, of course, was blessed for being faithful, and others in the time period were brought out of Israel. Verse 11, woe unto the wicked, for they shall perish, for the reward of their hand shall be upon them. Again, this is the law of restoration. This is reciprocity or reciprocation or restoration. And then verse 12, and my people, meaning those of Jerusalem, children are their oppressors. You know, in a difficult economic time when bread and water and clothing are scarce, and the enemy, has essentially besieged the city and destroyed, and many have been carried away, and the economy has been effectively destroyed. The temple has been destroyed. Children become the oppressors. I think in a sense that would have to do with the idea that caring for children would be oppressive because it would be hard to do. But also we get evidence that children are behaving proudly against the ancient in verse 5, so there's that as well. Anyway, children are their oppressors in some sense, probably because they're an economic burden even greater than they were before, although children should be, our prized possessions, but sometimes people, and certainly the wicked, see them sometimes in economic terms. They become oppressors, and women, in the absence of men leading, women rule over them, or they're left to lead the families, they're left to lead in society. And of course, their own children, the women and children are left without men in many cases because the men many of them have been deported, and others of them have died. Verse 25 indicates that some have died in the war, in defending the city and the region. And so women are suffering these economic burdens and these scarcity problems with their children, and they've become oppressive, the children have, because their needs are great, and the women are left alone. And then it says, "O my people, they who lead thee," and I think this is, not just the women, but largely those who lead thee, and that would include the men. They have caused thee to err, and they have destroyed the way of thy paths. You were in apostasy. Jerusalem had fallen into apostasy, and that's why verse 8 says Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah is fallen. Now, so the social order is breaking down, the family's breaking up, men are being carried off, women are having to govern their own homes and oversee the home and the finances and all the rest, and the children are suffering and becoming something of a burden to the families, and the leadership in Jerusalem has been wanting. The men, even before many of them were carried captive, their leadership they caused them to err and destroyed the way of the paths of the Lord. Verse 13, the Lord standeth up to plead, therefore. He pleads his cause, and he will judge his people. He sends judgments for their good, but he stands to plead with any who will follow him and repent and come unto him, and these things. Verse 14, the Lord will enter into judgment, therefore, with the ancients of his people and the princes thereof. He will enter into judgment, and he does. That's why he sends the Babylonians. Or the Babylonians come against Jerusalem and Judah. For ye have eaten up the vineyard. So another sin of the Jews and the men of Jerusalem and Judea is that they have eaten up the vineyard, which is the house of Israel, eaten up the vineyard and the spoil of the poor in their houses. In other words, they've been wealthy, they've been learned and wealthy, and now they've built homes and neglected the poor, and they've built unto themselves, homes, and they've used resources in a way that's not considerate of the poor and the needy and the less fortunate. Therefore, they have grinded upon the face of the poor. In verse 15, what you've done has been a grinding on the faces of the poor, saith the Lord of hosts. So these sins are perennial. Pride, wealth, sexual immoralities, the idea of, despising the speaking against the Lord and doing things that are against the commandments of God and breaking covenant with him and or despising the ways of the Lord. These things are manifest, and the poor are being oppressed, and the children are being oppressed. The poor and the children and the women are suffering a burden here to some degree, but they're not entirely without culpability, though. Verse 16 is the second half of the chapter, and here we get into the women and their own the judgments that were sent by God upon the women of Jerusalem and Judah, because the women themselves have been caught up in they're over-sexualized themselves. According to this, and I understand that the daughters of Zion, may refer to the men of Zion as well, but it seems like this chapter is divided in terms of gender. Men are addressed in the first 15 verses, the women are addressed, and the problems among the women are addressed from verses 16 through the end of the chapter. So the women, because the Lord saith to the women, because of the daughters of Zion are haughty, that means proud, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes. They're lustful, they're full of lust, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. Now, a lot of readers get bogged down in this catalog of details. It's all about the apparel of the women, and again, these women and apparently this society is caught up in the appearance of things. In this case, clothing. Remember, they lacked clothing. The Lord took their clothing away and took their bread and their water, and their clothing was scarce. But the women have been involved in, concerning themselves with high fashion and with expensive fashion. And these details, any commentary can help you unpack these details. But one caution I would give you, and this is Joseph Spencer's suggestion, who's a scholar in Isaiah, he says, don't get bogged down with the details. All you need to understand is sometimes the details are not entirely well known, like how to unpack particular details. Just get the understanding of the passage. And here it seems to suggest that the women of Jerusalem and Judah are caught up in the appearance of their clothing and in worldliness. And these are layers. You can see the layers of the material layers are given to us here in verses 18 through 23. We can see, detail after detail. These are layers, and this is the worldliness and the fashions and the worldly desires of the women of Jerusalem. Now, they were over-sexualized. They were haughty, walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes. So some of the men were struggling with sexual sin, and the women apparently had also lost their moral compass and also were struggling with, these types of things as well. The idea of wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go. And these things are incriminating also of the women of Jerusalem. And so both genders were struggling, and the women and the men were struggling with sexual immorality and with materialism, and they were valuing wealth and fashion and learning and all types of things, except they were not interested in the Lord and his laws and commandments. And this sounds all too much like our society, I'm afraid. Anyway, verse 25, we learn some of the men fell in the war with Babylon. Of course, that took some of the men away. Verse 26, and her gates, Jerusalem's gates, shall lament and mourn, and she, the city, shall be desolate and shall sit upon the ground. Jerusalem was ruined. This is in verse 8, and this is the image here in verse 26. Jerusalem was ruined. The temple was destroyed. Many were carried captive, and many were oppressed and afflicted, and this is true all the way down until they returned from captivity under Cyrus the Persian, they're able to return to Jerusalem and rebuild. But this is a great destruction upon the people of the Lord. They were in covenant with God, or they needed to be in covenant with God, but they weren't honoring they were full of iniquity in their tongues and their doings, and again in many ways. And the poor and the children and the others were suffering. Now, verse 1 of chapter 14 is often lumped in with chapter 13's material by the scholars, so I'll lump it in as well. And in that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man. Remember, men are scarce in this place. They'll take hold of one man. This is a custom among the Jews. They believed in, to some degree, plural marriage. In other words, 7 women would take hold of one man, saying, "We will eat our own bread. We'll try to find our own bread. And we have enough clothing, I guess. We have some clothing. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach before God." Or reproach meaning, in Israel, it was a reproach to not. It was a great blessing to marry in the covenant, and to marry a man, and to marry and to have the blessings that came into one's life, economically and otherwise, in terms of the cultural benefits of marriage. And so the women want to be married, but they're going to try to take care of their own bread and their own clothing, even though it's scarce. These are scarce times. They're apparently tapping into the blessings or the privileges, the legal privileges of marriage in verse 1. Now, what I wanted to say is how I break this up is you can break it up in terms of it's a male-female kind of divide in the chapter, or you can take the phrase "take away," which is found in verse 1 and in verse 18, and say, okay, the Lord says, "I will take away from Jerusalem and Judah these things," and then later he says, "I will take away these things from the daughters of Jerusalem and Judah." In the first verse, "I will take away these things from the men," and implicitly from society as well. So the word "take away" seems to organize the material, and the idea of gender seems to organize the material. And at the end, the first verse of 14, we learn that, "Let us be called by thy name," the women say to this one man, "to take away our reproach among men." Not so much before God, but among men. There's a reproach for not being in this marital relationship. Okay, now, so the Lord he's threatening here, he's prophetically threatening through Isaiah that Jerusalem will be destroyed. And of course, in the day that Isaiah spoke and wrote these things, this is preposterous. The great city, Jerusalem, how can it possibly, it has the temple, how can it possibly be destroyed? Well, it was destroyed, just like Isaiah prophesied, and it came to ruin. And all of these things came to pass according to the prophet's words. And the prophet spoke these judgments upon Jerusalem if they did not repent. And it turns out they did not repent. And Lehi preached, and others, Jeremiah, and others preached. But you know what? Jerusalem would not turn, and so the great city was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed, and had to be rebuilt. Later, in about 530, they came back. The Jews began to come back in and began to consider the rebuilding or the second temple at that point. All right, we'll pick up in our next video because I'm at 28 minutes now. Probably do chapter 14 as well as chapter 15 at the same time. I'll try to lump those together. And remember, a lot of these things are about the judgments of God upon Jerusalem and upon Judah. Only a little bit of this material is dedicated to Assyria, which is fascinating, but Assyria is mentioned in one of the chapters or two. And these are the judgments of God. Now, how can we hope? What's the message of hope? Well, verse 10, "Say unto the righteous, it is well with them, and they will receive according to the fruit of their own doings." Okay, so they will have from God what comes to them to have and to receive. So there is a glimmer of hope among this material on judgment. Thank you, and hopefully that was helpful to you on that. I'll get to the others maybe later today or another time this week.